and do this. So, let me begin with a question. And again, there's no right or wrong answer to it. How many of you have, let me start the easy way, have seen the Lord of the Rings films? Some of you. How many of you have read the novels before? Put them way up so I can really see them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. About 6 of you. Okay. How many of you have seen the Harry Potter films? Or some of the Harry Potter? Okay. Nearly all of you. How many of you have read the Harry Potter novels? Or some of them? Yeah. It's usually the case where you're much more familiar with the Harry Potter novels than you are with the Lord of the Rings. Especially folks your age and about 5 to 10 years older, probably. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings is, well, let me put it this way, was, until J.K. Rowling came around, one of the best-selling, and I'm going to use a word I've never used before, I think, with this course, or these books, franchises in the history of publishing. Okay? By 2000 or so, it had sold something like over 250 million copies. That is brand new copies. Okay? And then J.K. Rowling came around and just, blew all the stats totally out of the water. I mean, nobody will ever come close, again, to the publishing success that she has. We'll talk about her when we get to her. Now, I mentioned earlier that Tolkien kind of had a built-in audience when he published The Lord of the Rings. These dates here are referring to the publication dates for each of the individual volumes in the overall Lord of the Rings. So, July 29th, 1954 was when The Fellowship of the Ring was first published. Right? Several months later, November 11th, 1954, Two Towers was published. And then almost a year later, Return of the King was published. Now, if you've read The Lord of the Rings, or even if you've seen the films, you know that, the end of this, it's a bit of a cliffhanger. Okay? The end of this is a big cliffhanger. And then people have got to wait a year to find out what happens. Right? J.K. Rowling does, some of that also with publication of hers. So, when this is published in 1954, what kind of audience did Tolkien already have? A little bit of background. Tolkien was born in South Africa, brought to England. Father died at an early age. Raised Catholic. Demonstrated early on a facility, let's say, for languages. By the time he died, well, long before then, but he could read something like 20 or 21 languages. He could speak something like, I don't remember what the exact number is, 10 to 14. Welsh, Ancient Gaelic, Gothic, which is the earliest form of German, pretty much all the Germanic languages, French, Italian, Spanish, Finnish, which is not an Indo-European language at all, okay? Arabic, I'm pretty sure. Hebrew, because he translated for the Jerusalem Bible. Which book? Old Testament, Job or Jonah, one of those, okay? Just amazing ability with languages, okay? Went off to school, then went off to Oxford. Before he went off to Oxford, he went off to war, World War I, and we're going to talk about a passage that he mentions in the preface to the second edition, that, in 1918, when he would have been 26, all but one of his closest friends were dead. All but one. Okay? And he talks about what that means. Okay? Then he goes off to Oxford, graduates, and is named the Bosworth, the Rawlinson Anglo-Saxon chair, which means he has like an endowed position. He only has to deliver lectures a couple of times a year. The English system is not at all like ours, but he's expected to do a lot of research. And he does some. But beginning in World War I, literally, he's in the trenches, okay, in France. He starts creating a world that will become known as Middle Earth, okay? And it happens because when he was an undergraduate, what we consider an undergraduate, he had read Old English. He taught himself Old English before he went off to school. He was reading French and Greek and Latin when he was 8. Okay. He came across a piece of Old English literature. That's a good one, or the bad one? That's a good one. And it's what's called one of the Advent lyrics. And there is this line, Eala Earendel, which means essentially, lo, the morning star. Okay? And that kind of stuck in his head. And if you're a Tolkien nerd, you know what this becomes. This becomes, I'm going to misspell it, Earendel, okay, who becomes a major figure in what later is published as the Silmarillion, but who is referred to in The Lord of the Rings. Okay? And he turns this passage about a star into a passage about a person, a seafarer, a mariner. Okay? And he, because he has this idea pop into his mind, he's like, well, who is this guy? He kind of goes back to these questions. And he starts creating background in story. But it's all because of, at the same time, these languages he's been creating. Again, super nerd, super linguistic nerd. All right? Because Tolkien thought, you don't have a language without a what? Keep going. People who speak the language, right? Every language has speakers. We use language like coding language. Well, every coding language has what? A coder, someone who writes it. So you don't have languages without people, and with all people, with every group of people, you then get what? A culture that grows around. And what do people do with language? They communicate, but what else do? They tell stories. They record history. So Tolkien realized, I'm creating all these languages. These languages need to have a culture. They need to have a history. What comes before history? In the history of humanity, with every culture, before history gets written, what do you have before that? Louder? Events that take place. Keep going. Sometimes even before the events that take place. Well, let's take that back. Events cause people to sometimes do what? Like, they see this bright light in the sky.
People react. They record it.
They record it. What else do they do?
They create myths and legends.
What is that bright light?
It's like,
No, it might be the sun. It might be a comet. Where'd it come from? It just suddenly appeared one night. So you need an explanation. What causes those strange bright lights that flicker in the night during a storm? Well, if you're an ancient Greek, Zeus is ticked off and he's throwing his lightning bolts. if you're an ancient Scandinavian, Chris Hemsworth is up there throwing his lightning bolts, Thor. Okay? So you create a mythology. And the mythology is often peopled by superhuman-like people that become gods that then have an effect, etc., etc. So Tolkien gradually starts building these cultures and these ideas. Now, in the early 1930s, Tolkien is writing these stories. Not these stories, the background to these stories. The myths and legends and stories that underlay all of this, that are the foundation for all of this. Those don't become published until 1977, 5 years after his death, as the Silmarillion. Okay? They've since been republished by his son, Christopher Tolkien, one of his children, as The History of Middle-earth, a 12-volume series. And that is essentially every scrap about Middle-earth that Tolkien wrote, his son has published, with kind of interlocking explanations, introductions, things like that, right? So he's working on this stuff, and he's meeting together with other groups of writers, with another people, other writers, C.S. Lewis among them, Charles Williams, a variety of others, and this group has the name The Inklings, okay? And what these writers do is they get together at a pub, you gotta love the Brits, and have a beer and cigar or pipe or cigarette, and they sit around reading to each other what they've been writing. And so Tolkien is reading these background stories, okay? Beginning around 1931 or so. One summer morning, about, I want to say it's around 1933 or so, Tolkien is marking entrance exams to Oxford, okay? Blue books. And he's got the student's paper in front of him, and he turns the page. I've held this thing. He turns the page, blank sheet, and he writes, "In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit." And then he goes on and finishes marking the page, marking the paper. There's a problem with that. In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. Tolkien had never seen the word hobbit before. He'd never heard the word hobbit before. So where did it come from? Hobbits had not figured into the stories he was working on, the background of Middle-earth, at all at this point. And so he writes that, and then he starts to think, what's a hobbit? And he starts telling his 4 children a story about a hobbit. And that hobbit is named Bilbo Baggins. That story becomes the book, The Hobbit, or There and Back Again, which gets published in 1937. Okay? And it is immediately internationally acclaimed as a classic, which is kind of odd because something isn't usually called a classic until it has stood the test of time. But it's immediately hailed as this great work of children's literature. Tolkien did not think of it necessarily, that is like a requirement, as children's literature. He just thought of it as a fairy story, a romance novel. Not romance, sex and love and that kind of stuff. The old idea of romance, where you have something mysterious or miraculous, you have an adventure, a quest of some kind, okay? Gets his picture on the cover of Time magazine, if I remember correctly. Might be mistaken there, okay? And from that point on, he's receiving letters. Tell us more. I want to hear more. not only about this Hobbit, but about some ideas that are referred to, or events that are referred to in the Hobbit, like the fall of Gondolin and elves and the men of Westernessa. Tell us more. Okay? So Tolkien starts working on a sequel. That becomes The Lord of the Rings. And yet what he doesn't intend happens. That is, an element of The Hobbit gets wound into the very center of The Lord of the Rings. Because The Hobbit one of the key things that happens in The Hobbit, I put my ring on my key thing when I go work out, is Bilbo finds a ring. Turns out the ring is a magic ring. Makes you invisible. That becomes the link between The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, and the earlier stories. And it's all, in Tolkien's way of describing it, however, it's kind of all by accident. That is, he doesn't set out The Lord of the Rings going, I'm going to take the ring that Bilbo found in The Hobbit, and I'm going to make it key to The Lord of the Rings. It's like he's riding along, and it just happens. How writers create what they create fascinates me. Stephen King, there's a little passage where Stephen King says, it's this little quote is in the textbook I use for my Intro to Lit course. And he says what he does is he gets a bunch of characters and put them in a room and then sees what happens. It's like, what the hell? You create these characters. Don't tell me you just see what happens. You make, according to a lot of authors, that's not what happens. It's they come up with the characters and then they kind of go. And the characters have their own lives. Like, switch gears for just a moment. For those of you who know, almost all of you have read or seen the Harry Potter novels. How did J.K. Rowling come up with the idea of Harry Potter? Anybody know the story? She's on a train from Manchester to London. She is a single, unwed mother living on Scottish version of welfare. I mean, she barely has 2 pennies to scratch to her name, right? And at one moment on this train, she is a single, unwed mother with very little to her name and an unsuccessful writer. She'd been writing stories since she was like 10 or 11. Never published a thing. And like 5 seconds later, she has this idea in her mind about a boy named Harry Potter who discovers on the morning of his 11th birthday that his parents were murdered by the greatest dark wizard who ever lived, and that dark wizard is after him. How? Where did that idea come from? Why didn't it happen to one of you? Or more importantly, why not me? Because what happens to her life? That happens in 1991. Within 16 years, 1991 to 2007, she goes from essentially being penniless to what? A billionaire. It's a B. What is it? 9 zeros? She goes from being penniless to being wealthier than Queen Elizabeth II. Okay, maybe not including all the artwork and all that kind of stuff, but cash, Why? Because an idea popped into her head. Where does that creative inspiration come from? And notice the word inspiration. Inside. Spire, to breathe. It's like something was breathed into her. From where? Well, it's an idea that there might be something out there that comes into it that Tolkien will address a little bit. Okay? So he writes The Hobbit, and then he begins writing the stories that will become The Lord of the Rings in about 1938. So I can put down 1938 here, and notice the first book, the first volume, isn't published for 16 years. One of the reasons for that is because Tolkien was notorious at revising. He was a perfectionist. Okay? Now, a couple other little background things. Tolkien was a professor of Anglo-Saxon, Old English literature. Old English is not what our modern world kind of says it is, because the modern world will say, Shakespeare and other writers of old. No, Shakespeare wrote and spoke our English. Accent's just a little different. Old English is the language spoken in Anglo-Saxon England from about 500 AD to a little after 1100 AD. Here's the Lord's Prayer, or part of it at least, in Old English. Fader ure thuthi art on heavenum, sithi nama helgod, to bekomet in riche, je worthy din wila on earthen, swa on heavenum. Okay? Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy will be done on earth as it is in. Okay? There's some that you can maybe recognize a little bit, like fader and ure, our, and heavenum, heavens, etc. But most of it, whoosh, gone. All right? So Tolkien was a professor of that. In 1936, he delivered a lecture, public lecture, that was published, called Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics. What in the world does this have to do with The Lord of the Rings? Well, an awful lot, it turns out. Beowulf is the greatest surviving piece of Old English literature. Big, long, epic poem about Beowulf, the character, the hero. Okay? His essay was about the monsters in that poem and modern literary critics. Because modern literary critics said, up to that point, the monsters are unimportant. Grendel's mother, and the dragon, totally unimportant. What's important about Beowulf is what the poem tells us about ancient Germanic customs. Gift giving, ring wearing, how they fight their battles, blah, 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 blah. In other words, they used that poem the way an awful lot of people today use, I'm using that term intentionally, literature. What can I get out of it? That is, it's something totally to be analyzed. What's the literal meaning of the word analyze? If you analyze water, what do?
Break it down into its composite parts.
Break it down into its component elements. H2O. 2 atoms of hydrogen to 1 atom of oxygen. Okay? Tolkien said, wrong, wrong, wrong. That's not what you do with literature. You don't break it down. Because when you break it down, what are you left with? You're left with what Hamlet says in response to a character, words, words, words. That is, words. You're left with ingredients. You're not left with the thing itself. If you take the Old English poem Beowulf and you try to simply break it down into all these little elements, what are you left with? Take your car, and start taking it apart. Go out on your driveway, start taking it apart, put all the wheels, take the axles apart, take the brakes, set it all out. What are you left with? Parts. Can you get in that and drive to work? No. Can you look at all that and tell what year, model, and make it is? Probably not. In other words, you've broken something to try to determine what it is. If you're a real Tolkien nerd, you probably just caught an allusion, Allusion, to something a character says in Fellowship of the Ring. Gandalf says, he that would break a thing to find out what it is has left the path of wisdom. So, Tolkien says, The monsters are central to the poem. Central. You don't have the work without the poem. Okay? That kind of made him famous, at least among Anglo-Saxon scholars, right? So that when he sends this manuscript off in 1937, typescript off, the publisher gets it, a guy by the name of Stanley Unwin. The publisher gets it, he's like, the what? The Hobbit? What's a Hobbit? He doesn't know what to do with this thing. And even worse, it's written by some egghead Anglo-Saxon professor. What am I going to do with this? So he gets it, and he gives it to his 10-year-old son. This is a publisher. He gives a manuscript, typescript, to his 10-year-old son and says, Rainer, I want you to read this. Tell me what you think. 10-year-olds in 1937 or 1936 or so were obviously very different than 10-year-olds today, because the son says, yes, Father, I will do that for you. And he takes it and he writes a review for his father. And he says, this is a great story. You should publish it. And so he does. Now, he doesn't immediately run out, stop the presses, and order 500,000 copies of The Hobbit. I think the initial press run was something like 750. I mean, it was really small. If you were to be browsing in some old, beaten down, used bookstore in Oxford, and you found a first printing of the 1937 first edition of The Hobbit, by all means, beg, borrow, steal if you have to keep that thing. Why? Because it's probably worth several $100,000. Well, take that back. It would be worth several $100,000 because there were so few. And so it sold out. And he's like, fluke? Maybe. He printed another print run. I think the next one had like 1,500. Boom, sold out. He realizes, yeah. And so he starts printing more. They sell out. That's why Tolkien becomes internationally famous. Okay? And very briefly, in late 38, Tolkien's invited to deliver a lecture at St. Andrews University. It's called the Andrew Lang Lecture. Andrew Lang was for lack of a better term, fairy taleologist. There's a term for that, and I can't remember what it is off the top of my head. Who wrote about fairy stories and collected fairy stories and published them in a series of books called the Rainbow Books, because each book had a different color. Had nothing with LGBTQ, etc. Okay? Each book had a different color cover, right? Tolkien wasn't the first choice. He was like third. Okay? And so he goes and he delivers this lecture titled On Fairy Stories that then gets published in 1947 in a collection of essays dedicated to Charles Williams, one of the members of that group, the Inklings, who had died by that point. Okay? If you really want to understand everything Tolkien wrote, Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, Silmarillion, you've got to read this. It gives you the key to understanding Tolkien. Why? Because it's about fairy stories, but in it, Tolkien claims fairy stories are not for children. Fairy stories are for us. Us, me, more than you. Why? Because you guys are closer to the age of children than I am. Right? You're not as yet pessimistic, skeptical, jaded, 1 foot in the grave as I am. You might still have that little bit of that sense of wonder where something can make you go, which Tolkien says children have naturally, right? Take a 3-year-old for a walk, on a trail. They'll pick up a rock. What a cool rock. This is totally awesome looking. And you're going, it's a rock, put it down. You don't know what animal, whatever on that, Or it's a bottle cap. This is, put it down, it's trash. Okay? Tolkien says we adults are the ones who need fairy stories. Why? Because he says fairy stories give us 4 things. Very, very quickly. We have, shoot, I thought I had 5 minutes. We have 3 minutes. They give us fantasy, recovery, escape, and consolation. Fantasy. He just calls kind of arresting strangeness. They take us outside our everyday existence, right? Is your everyday existence arrestingly strange? No. If it's anything like mine, it's mind-achingly dull and boring. The thing that was so amazing, when the first Star Wars came out in 1977, one of the things, was how it began. That big old Star Destroyer comes from the top of the screen. Well, even before that. The words that go from the bottom to and disappear. But then that Star Destroyer comes in, and it's not like the spaceships in Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey, which looked like they'd just gotten off the assembly line. Brand spanking new and shiny white, etc. This thing has blast marks. Okay? You immediately know we're not in Kansas anymore. Recovery. This is one of the most important things. Tolkien means by recovery, seeing as we were meant to see. Okay. That is, not how we do see, but seeing as we were meant to see. And what he means by that, one of the things he means by that, I'll talk a little bit about this on Thursday. Seeing everything as distinct and original and new. Seeing each individual as totally separate and other. You guys are all totally separate and other to me, because I've never seen you before. But my wife, who I've been married to for 37 years, dull, boring, ball chain, the whole 9 yards. But when I first saw her, literally, when I first saw her, I thought, before I'd even spoken a word, I'm going to marry her. Took a while for me to beat down her defenses. I'll talk about that story, okay? But he's saying that now at 37 years, I should see her still the way I first saw her. It's like, every now and then you see a sunset and it just takes your breath away. It's that. Seeing a glory in everything. Yes, Tolkien would even say, in this god-awful, ugly building, which should be consigned to the lowest depths of hell. Why? If you think about it, it's amazing in and of itself. Now, that could be interpreted different ways, obviously. Okay, we'll stop there. I'll talk very briefly about escape and consolation on Thursday, and then we'll get behind. Wake up.